exploring an endless universe, collecting otherworldly weapons and gadgets, and doing it all with your robotic bestie strapped to your back. These are just a few of the hallmarks of the Ratchet and Clank series. It's a franchise that's remained a steady favourite for nearly 2 decades, and still doesn't show any sign of letting up. It's constantly finding new ways to surprise fans of unique mechanics and engaging design, with each iteration breaking down boundaries between game genres, allowing a slew of brand new possibilities with every adventure. The series is responsible for 16 games, a manga, and an extensive line of merchandise, and even a Hollywood film. Let's take a look at how this humble game about ingenuity, friendship, and blowing up aliens grew to become one of the biggest names on the PlayStation market. The story begins with a young Ted Price, the future founder and CEO of Insomniac Games, the company that would be responsible for the creation of Ratchet and Clank. But before all of that, Ted was just a kid with a wild dream. He knew from the age of 9 that he wanted to make games, and this was something that stayed with him all the way through his time at university. His desire to be more creative and artistic led him to setting up his own video game company in 1994, Insomniac Games. He soon hired fellow university graduate and avid programmer Alex Hastings to be his chief architect, placing him in charge of the technical side of game design. Price also hired Brian Hastings, Alex's brother, to be responsible for the creative direction of games. Now, with the core team assembled, Insomniac got to work on their first venture into the gaming industry, Disruptor. This first-person shooter was developed in the hopes of supplying the industry's demand for exciting new shoot-'em-ups. Price, like so many who grew up in the back end of the 20th century, was in love with the game Doom. The game was adored by critics, with a lot of the attention being aimed towards the variety of gameplay and the unique weapons. Despite their best efforts, the game was poorly marketed, resulting in the title falling short of their expectations. As a result of this poor performance, Insomniac was already on the verge of bankruptcy. Fortunately, and surprisingly, the game's publishers, Universal Interactive, decided not to cut ties with the team following the game's weak sales. They wanted to continue their partnership. The team rallied behind Price and kept moving forward with renewed faith in their next project. Enter Spyro the Dragon. With its release in 1998, Spyro helped propel Insomniac to the top of the gaming industry. Not only was it a massive accomplishment in game design and graphical advancements, it was a huge hit with fans. And it successfully helped Insomniac amass a significant following. With this one game, Ted Price and his team had gone from underdogs to high-ranking stars. But 2 Spyros later, Price and co were ready to move on to something new, with original characters. Reluctant to overdo it with the Spyro series, Insomniac parted ways with Universal, and began working on their next project directly with Sony. The only question was, what now? There were a lot of ideas floating around the Insomniac office. Having come hot off such a popular series, there was some anxiety about producing a follow-up. They knew they were more than a one-hit wonder, but they still had to prove it. Insomniac were determined to do things right, so ideas came and went, with only a few making it to planning stages, and nothing going much further. 2 of the main ideas to be planned out were Monster Night and 1080 Pinball. Monster Night was an action-adventure game about using unique monsters as weapons. 1080 Pinball was, well, exactly as it sounds. A first-person stealth action game. No wait, sorry. It was a pinball game, and a far reach from the out-of-the-box direction they wanted to take. They went back to the drawing board, and Insomniac started development on a title drawing inspiration from The Legend of Zelda and Tomb Raider. This project was titled Girl with a Stick. Granted, the game didn't have the most captivating title, but past face value, it had a lot going for it. For a start, there was a rich fantasy setting, with some serious RPG elements, a sure step in a different direction from Spyro. Ted Price was excited by the development of this project. It was different, interesting, and, importantly, not a platformer. Insomniac spent 6 months designing the engine and knocking together a demo for the game, but the whole team found themselves becoming less passionate about Girl with a Stick. Not only were there concerns about the game being bland and one-dimensional, but there was a much bigger elephant in the room. The game just wasn't fun. It was back to the drawing board for Insomniac, and morale was lower than ever. Price still refers to Girl with a Stick as the company's first failure, but he maintains that it was a necessary lesson.
We were going to be back in this limbo of not having a game design. However, as you guys pointed out, it was nice coming back in and knowing that everybody, or most people, felt relief and like we had a fresh start and we had just kind of saved ourselves from a pretty awful next 2 years.
But then, one day, while the team were brainstorming, Brian Hastings decided to toss out an idea for a space-traversing adventure filled with all sorts of cutting-edge weapons and gadgets and science fiction tropes. And suddenly, everybody's ears pricked up. It was a remarkably ambitious project. In fact, it was too ambitious for the pre-existing hardware. But Sony's newest console had the power and capabilities to bring the Insomniac dream to life. All systems were a go, and the team's first entry onto the brand spanking new PlayStation 2 was underway. In Brian Hastings' initial vision, the protagonist was a slender, shifty reptilian space explorer, but this was abandoned early on, because the team felt they wanted the character's aesthetic design to match his playable abilities. Their leading character went through various incarnations, including as anthropomorphized rats and dogs. The final design was a feline-human hybrid, a species the team called a Lombax. They dubbed the creation Ratchet, named in accordance with his profession as a mechanic. To accompany Ratchet, the developers wanted a sidekick, more precisely a miniature robot with a big intellect and an even bigger heart. He was intended to just help move the plot along, and served mostly as a reason for Ratchet to explore the galaxy. But over time, the character went from a simple gameplay device to sharing the spotlight with Ratchet. He was given a distinct personality and motivations. They named this little robot fella Clank. Narratively, the game wasn't drastically changed. The team were just looking for an organic way to have players explore different planets. But soon enough, as Clank's character developed, this narrative changed. The duo had different ambitions, and through their partnership, they could achieve their goals, intertwining two stories in one. Ratchet wanted to explore the galaxy and leave his home far behind, and Clank wanted to get a message to the most famous hero in the universe.
Currently, I'm in search of someone who could be of assistance in saving the solar system. Do you know where I might find that fellow?
The narrative designers felt they had a far more interesting dynamic to play with throughout the game. They wanted the relationship to emulate that of a classic buddy cop film, something like Lethal Weapon, Bad Boys, or Men in Black. Ted Price's goal for Ratchet and Clank was always about setting itself apart from Spyro, and this directly impacted the choices in regard to gameplay. The team integrated more complex movement options and a more distinct focus on combat, especially by including a large variety of weapons, providing a more strategic approach to firefights. Insomniac were immensely pleased with the project that they were working on. Everybody was passionate and invested in this game. As production ended, everybody believed that they had a hit on their hands, but more importantly, they felt that nobody could say that their first success was a fluke. They'd hit it big with Spyro, and they were certain they were about to do it again. But it wasn't just a casual copy and paste job. Where Spyro was a jaunty collectathon, Ratchet and Clank was all about pure carnage, and causing as much mayhem as possible. There was nothing left to do but wait and see the world's reaction to Ratchet and Clank. After a year and a half of development, the game was released in late 2002. Insomniac were hoping for a home run, and it soon became clear that their optimism was well placed. Fans and critics alike praised the game, including the graphics, soundtrack, and the gameplay. Ratchet and Clank quickly became a huge favourite for gaming fans across the globe. It rapidly earned its greatest hit status after selling over 400,000 copies in 1 year. In Japan, the game was bundled with the PS2 to help drive console sales, making it the only game to do so in the region. But it wasn't without its issues. Being a new IP on brand new hardware, there were bound to be teething problems. But while other games were dealing with criticisms over clumsy controls, game bugs, and gameplay, Ratchet and Clank was receiving some much harder to hear feedback. Many players found Ratchet and Clank themselves to be unlikable. Vocal critics deemed Ratchet was snarky, cynical, and cold towards his companion.
I wonder what that infobot is for.
Maybe it can replace you.
And Clank also found himself in the firing line. While he was less of a target for complaints, people were quick to point out that he could be arrogant and stuffy, only focused on the task at hand.
Ratchet, this is no time for you to become cautious. We have reached our goal.
I don't know. There's something fishy going on here.
It was even more difficult to take when close friends over at Naughty Dog premiered the stars of their Jak and Daxter franchise to wide acclaim. This dealt a pretty significant blow to the whole Insomniac team. Even though the game was critically and commercially popular, they'd invested a lot of time into perfecting every detail, from the world to the characters. And they found it a real shame that the fans weren't as connected to the game as they were. There were also some concerns that if people really didn't like the characters, it could spell a short-lived series, without the multifaceted saga they'd envisioned. They'd only just started this journey, with the hopes of being able to flesh out every detail of the universe, the characters, and the lore. Nobody wanted to pack it in this early. So, Price and the rest of the Insomniac team accepted the constructive criticism and committed themselves to redesigning all the aspects that didn't land with the players. If that meant going back to the drawing board, then that's what they were going to do. But even with these issues, Insomniac had laid a robust foundation. There was so much more that could be done with these characters, the universe, and the game's mechanics. The only question was, how far could they take it? And how would they do it? Ratchet and Clank was released to acclaim, and fans were keen to see more from this duo. With a sequel already approved by Sony 5 months before the first game came out, Insomniac were adamant to produce a game that remedied any and all criticism they had received. So the team went into the next game with the mindset of adapt or die.
How did you know that?
They wanted to keep what made the first game popular, and rework or outright remove anything that wasn't working.
So, I agree to take you to
For Insomniac, it wasn't about throwing a fresh coat of paint on characters and environments. It was about going back to the core of Ratchet and Clank, revitalizing what made it special to them, and building on it by bringing in new elements and reinvigorating the gameplay. The sequel was called Ratchet and Clank Going Commando, setting the trend of the series being risque with its titles. Another trend that began with this game was how Insomniac chose to develop it. After the lukewarm reception to certain aspects of the original, Insomniac were relying on casting a wide net to gather fan feedback. They wanted to know where they needed to be better and how they could do it. Their dedication to giving the fans what they want out of their game became standard practice for the remainder of the franchise. The first thing they sought to address was the problems of the main characters. Clank was a relatively easy fix. They eased up his personality, allowing him to be more laid back and leisurely.
Absolutely, sir. We just came here to race.
The developers relaxed Ratchet slightly as well. He was still a bit impulsive and eager for adventure, but he was more cheery, considerate, and far kinder to his little robot chum.
You did great. Now, let's go get that experiment back.
But Insomniac really wanted the noticeable differences to be in Ratchet. To achieve this, they replaced the voice actor. The role was taken on by James Arnold Taylor, a veteran voice actor who made a name for himself voicing various characters in What's New Scooby-Doo, and bringing life to the popular character of Tidus in Final Fantasy X. Given Taylor's impressive range, he seemed the perfect fit to help Ratchet find his voice.
The greatest thing about Ratchet is he's my voice, because most of my career I'm doing other voices. So yeah, people would never guess when they see this frame that, I'm the voice of Fred Flintstone. And did you know that I'm Flint?
Yabba dabba doo, that's right, so picture that.
The change was considered a suitable adjustment to match the character's more mature personality, and Taylor went on to voice Ratchet in all subsequent releases. In terms of gameplay, development for Going Commando was focused on designing a few big concepts to help elevate the standard fixtures of the game. Some of the ideas that made the final game were spherical levels, space dogfights, giant Clank levels, and arena battles. The team really wanted to raise the stakes and expand the scope for this game. Along with the newer gameplay mechanics, Insomniac were keen to push the technology as far as it would allow them. But through the actual development, their ambition caught up with them. After beginning the 7-month journey with only 40 employees working on the game, they were struggling to get to where they wanted to be. But Ted Price and his team never lost sight of what was important to them. They went all in on making the best game that they could for their fans. The workplace was doubled in the middle of production, and they were finally able to control the project. Equipped with an all-new array of weapons and gadgets, players played the new and improved Ratchet and Clank. The revamped movement, stylized levels, and the character alterations were specifically noted as huge improvements by critics. Their fanbase were thrilled with the changes, and Sony were pleased with the game's strong performance, and they wanted more. They gave the studio everything they needed to finish off their envisioned trilogy. And so, Insomniac started development on the game to tie it all up your arsenal. As the innuendo might have suggested, this was going to be Insomniac's cheekiest and boldest entry into the series so far. Just as they had for the previous game, the team worked extensively with fans to better understand the demands of the players. Insomniac wanted to make a game so rich with diverse and exciting content that it felt like 2 or 3 games all rolled into one. They wanted this to be the jewel in Ratchet and Clank's crown, and to encapsulate every element of the franchise that had proved a hit with players. The final product was a game that the developers believed could appeal to just about everyone. The trilogy was complete, and Ratchet and Clank had established themselves as the premier mascots for Sony. But now, Insomniac were gearing up to take things in a new direction. Insomniac's first foray into this new direction was in the form of their 4th release, Ratchet Deadlocked. This was the first game to break away from their tried and tested formula. This more aggressive, shooting-focused game was an attempt to adapt to the new gaming climate. People didn't seem as interested in the whimsical exploits of cute mascots anymore. In 2005, it was all about games like Halo and Call of Duty, where the mantra was shoot first and ask questions later. In the developers' eyes, the exciting combat was what people liked most about Ratchet and Clank anyway, so why not just make a game where that's a central focus? But the end result failed to really connect with the fans. People didn't hate the gameplay, on the contrary, the combat was as fun as ever. But what was missing was all the other elements that made Ratchet and Clank stand apart from the crowd. And with that, 2006 didn't see a new Ratchet and Clank release, breaking the chain of annual releases. But the team still felt there was a lot more to explore, both in terms of the character stories and with exciting game mechanics afforded to them by tech advancements. Insomniac were launching a new era of Ratchet and Clank, the Future Saga. With the next generation console PlayStation 3 coming out, Insomniac wanted to get back to the core of Ratchet and Clank. They'd learned where they'd gone wrong in Deadlocked and were ready to bring back the exploration, the platforming, and the silliness, not to mention bringing Clank back into the title. They sought to do this in Ratchet and Clank Tools of Destruction. After 2 years of development, Tools of Destruction was released, and it was praised by critics for its technical improvements. But more importantly, the new game was happily accepted by the fans. This is the series they fell in love with, and they were on board for this new adventure. In the beginning, when Ratchet and Clank was just a passion project, they had no idea how big it would become, or how many iterations of the game there would be. And 7 years on from the first game, the team released A Crack in Time, a popular fan favorite and often considered by many Insomniac employees as the best they'd made in the series. After A Crack in Time, Insomniac believed that they had peaked with the Ratchet and Clank series, and they were ready to go out on a high. However, Sony felt that it would be irresponsible to not capitalize on the success. Despite having the creative control of their titles, Insomniac were a small fry compared to Sony, so they had to play ball. It was agreed that they would get more out of the series, and provide a few more titles for the PlayStation. The result was something that just didn't feel right. They were creating these games to meet a quota, rather than because they were compelled to continue with their initial vision. Insomniac released 2 spin-offs, All for One and Full Frontal Assault, but the games missed the mark with fans, and so the team developed Into the Nexus, a game designed to provide closure and serve as an epilogue to the Future Saga. But nothing was able to really scratch that edge. Something felt off. The games weren't all that bad, but it just wasn't Ratchet and Clank. and, following the lukewarm response, Insomniac were allowed to close the door on the series, sadly, on a low note. Ratchet and Clank went on a hiatus, and some people believed that one of the most popular PlayStation IPs was done forever. But then, after 3 long years, Ratchet and Clank came out of the woodwork with something new. The team announced that, to accompany the Hollywood film, they were going to release a reimagined version of the very first game. The game design was significantly different to its source material, as the team wanted to highlight the progression of the series. The game completely obliterated the sales records of most other games in the franchise, and it became the fastest selling title in the collection, and the meteoric success of the game actively showed Insomniac that there was still passion for the series, and a thirst for more. The Ratchet & Clank series has earned its place among some of the most popular franchises in video game history. The PlayStation 2 remains the pinnacle of console nostalgia for millions, and very few other games were as synonymous with the console as Ratchet & Clank was. But quite possibly there is one aspect that helps Ratchet & Clank stand out far beyond the rest: its humor.
Blast it!
Look, plumber's crack.
What did you just say?
I said, look, the plumber's back.
All right, wise guy.
The Ratchet & Clank games were rough and tumble adventures with some complex themes, but it never shied away from being goofy and childish. Most shooters aimed for realism, the reality of war, bloodshed, and loss. It was a serious affair. But Ratchet & Clank turned general perceptions on their head. They took the guns and made a silly game where you jump and flip around having a blast both in the game and on the sofa. The commitment to having innuendos in the titles of games was just one way that they dared to be different. The narratives didn't ever take themselves too seriously, but behind the scenes it was clear that so much time and effort was put into making each game as fun and entertaining as possible. The Ratchet & Clank series is one that will forever be attached to fans. Not just for the slick and engaging content, but for the charm, the attitude, and the hours of fun. Ratchet & Clank started out as the very definition of a passion project, and over a slew of titles each bolder than the last, they became some of the most recognizable faces of gaming. The unique approach of heavy action platformer and goofy humor, accompanied by tight controls and innovative design, helped the game stay relevant. It was a series committed to adapting for its audience. Insomniac were always willing to listen to their fans, and were prepared to build the game around their wants and needs for the series, focusing on giving the very best of what was possible, and still staying true to the roots of what came before. Make sure you tune in next time for another origin story.
Offer complete service at Groovy Lube.